I'm with Dominic from Binnari Property today, Head of Research at Binnari Property. And Dom, just going to talk about the Gold Coast property market and how you see it shaping up for 2026. We're looking at it from an investor perspective. And in doing so, there's always markets within markets. And indeed, within the Gold Coast market, you've got that narrow strip from the coast to probably 20 k's wide through to the mountains. And then probably 50 k's from the Tweed Heads up to Southport, let's say. Maybe a bit beyond that. So that sort of drives the limited availability of land, notwithstanding you've got the high rise. But I'm a bit of a fan of the Gold Coast. If there's a place I'm going to move to, I suppose out of Sydney, I'd probably choose the Gold Coast. What's been happening in the Gold Coast, and how do you see it shaping up in the next 12 months? Because it's certainly had a lot of growth in recent years.
Well, I think you're not alone. It seems like a lot of people choose the Gold Coast as their alternate place to be if they're not in, say, Sydney or somewhere else. And as a result of that, as you say, prices have increased dramatically. I mean, from COVID probably started that push with a lot of people relocating to places like the Gold Coast whilst being able to work, whereas prior to that it was probably more so relocating at a later age, I suppose. But the Gold Coast now is, it's done extremely well. I mean, the property prices up there are a lot higher and much harder to get into. The development has changed, I think, a lot from what was once upon a time high rises made up of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments now to be much more owner-occupier style apartments where you've got your 2s and your 3s predominantly, larger floor plates.
We've even got those sort of half and whole
floors, whole floors.
I think I get a sense just talking to people, agents on the Gold Coast, there is a bit of an oversupply in that sort of market, certainly that whole floor market. Yeah.
I mean, you're asking big money and there's a lot of them now, so, but I think the fact that they've shifted away from what was once upon a time, just a lot of quantity of apartments to now having less of them at those larger style floor plates and things has helped from a supply and demand perspective. The thing that always surprised me about the Gold Coast is the rental returns. I was only up there a few weeks ago looking at some townhouses that were, 8 minutes back from the coastline towards Broadbeach, but sort of a little bit inland. They were brand new townhouses done really, really nicely with some nice communal amenity. 90% of them sold to owner-occupiers at sort of $2.5 million. But the couple that were sold to investors are renting for $2,300 a week at some scenarios. So those yields you're not typically seeing when you get up to those price points. The one thing we always used to say to people was, as you exceed the $1 million mark, expect your rental yield to sort of fall away a little bit. And often that's when it becomes more of a capital growth driven play as opposed to a yield driven play. But the Gold Coast seems to be the one market which kind of doesn't have that. And they're still seeing really strong yields even in that more luxury property market. So yeah, it's interesting. The market's done really well. I don't necessarily see it slowing down massively because of what you just mentioned with it's quite a small amount of land for the amount of demand we've got coming in. And I think always the coast, on the East Coast particularly, has been something that people strive to be near if they can. And being in an area that has such a limited amount of land along the coast in such a narrow sort of strip that runs along that pocket there's always going to be an element of scarcity. The only thing, as you mentioned, is the apartment market. But even then, there's markets within markets where when you're on one side of the highway versus the other side of the highway, they're going to run out of land and things like that. So it's a really strong market. I think it's only going to continue to improve with the infrastructure, the new tram that they're putting in there, which seems to be taking a little while, but they will get there in the end. And obviously when that's there, it makes it very easy to commute up and down. So yeah, it's done really well.
Yeah, and I think the other thing with the Gold Coast market is that there's a lot of, it's a pretty hip and happening place to be. I mean, the restaurants are certainly vastly different to probably what it was 10 or 15 years ago in terms of the amenity and opportunity there to enjoy yourself. The shopping centres, but also restaurants if people are going there. The other thing about the Gold Coast, it's got, compared to, say, a Brisbane market, the Gold Coast has that international appeal. So there's people that want to go to the Gold Coast to visit, whether it's short term or longer term. They want to go to the Gold Coast versus other markets where it doesn't have such an international appeal beyond Australia. But the Gold Coast has that appeal beyond the Gold Coast, within Australia, and even beyond that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the airport there has got international flights now, which it didn't always have in the past. It's got the emergence of great hotels and great restaurants and things like that really changed the lifestyle aspect of it. Like once upon a time, you travelled to the Gold Coast, you kind of went to surface was your sort of main pocket of entertainment and sort of that sort of thing. Whereas now you've got Burleigh, you've got Broadbeach, you've got parts of Mermaid Beach and things like that, Palm Beach, where there's so many cool things that have popped up. The pubs are getting better, the restaurants are getting better, and all that sort of thing.
Well,
which
even
makes
that main beach area, I think that's getting really redeveloped over the next 5 or more years. And some of the buildings that are going there, the marina, etc. That's with big marina berths, etc. Reinvigorating that area that was probably big in the 80s and early 90s. It's
exactly.
Getting a new lease of life.
Yeah. So, and I think like with all of those things happening, vacancy rates seem to be very low. I think a lot more of the purchases of those apartments and things are now owner-occupiers versus historically probably being a lot of investors and so forth. Whereas now with the prices being a fair bit higher, you're getting a lot more owner-occupier demand. Yeah. And with owner-occupier demand, a lot of those apartments aren't really, the supply of them isn't being felt as much as when you've got a lot of them hitting the rental markets at the same time and things like that. So vacancies are low, property prices are up pretty much in line with what Brisbane's done in the last sort of 12 or so months. So, near that sort of 5 to 10% mark in terms of growth, which is a great result, coming off the back of what was already a very, very strong period during those COVID years. So my view on the Gold Coast would be that to expect much of the same in the next few years, and we'll continue to see prices remain quite strong because even though you have the scope to bring on more supply there, it doesn't mean that bringing on supply is super easy. You've still got the challenges that persist around the country.
Projects that won't get off the ground there that's going to impact it. And I think the other thing with the Gold Coast market is you do have an element of part of the owner-occupied market is unoccupied owner-occupiers. In other words, they bought it and they use it as a weekender from Brisbane or from Melbourne or whatever. Yeah. But certainly the Brisbane, there's an element of Brisbane to people that have an apartment there that's not. So that sort of constrains the available market as well. Yeah. Do you think the Gold Coast is going to have any sort of flow-on effects from the Olympics? Because there are events, I think, being held on the Gold Coast. So there's that. It's part of that Brisbane catchment in a sense that Brisbane's certainly going to benefit from the Olympics. But I think, do you agree that the Gold Coast is going to
use Sydney as an example, when Sydney does really well, Newcastle, Wollongong tend to do quite well as well, and the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast both are probably a bit more attached to Brisbane than, say, what Newcastle is to Sydney. So I think when Brisbane does well, they tend to do well as well. And I think that with the Olympic Games, it's probably going to have a big benefit to a lot of Queensland, but particularly that Southeast Queensland pocket, which is Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast and Brisbane. So I think for a lot of people, moving up to Brisbane, moving up to the Gold Coast, or moving up to Queensland, living on the Gold Coast and commuting to Brisbane once or twice a week if needed is a pretty attractive sort of lifestyle. When you've got the beaches and you've got that sort of very attractive place to be, but also still within close enough proximity to a capital city that has all the other job opportunities that you would sort of seek and look for. And as the Gold Coast continues to grow and so forth, they'll have more of an employment hub there themselves. And I think it's already moving in that direction too. A lot more people working and living in the Gold Coast. So, the prospects for that market are very strong, I'd say.
Great. Well, Dominic, thanks for your insights on the Gold Coast property market for 2026.
Thanks, Grant.
Thanks.